Hi folks, welcome back to the plot. One of the questions I get asked the most is about feeding, in particular my chili peppers. You all know I'm a chili pepper lover, and so today we're going to be talking a bit about plant feeding, not just chilies, but do you need to feed, what do you feed them, when do you feed them, and how do you feed them, and maybe some other questions that I think of at the time. One thing I have done is just rigged up some chicken wire. So just some basic defense here against, hopefully, the kind of rodents and the foxes. And we're at the time of year now, coming into summer, where your plants are starting to fruit. And it's really worth being aware of the fact that you might not see them, but you're quite likely to have little mice or rats about, and trying to keep them out of your greenhouse is a really good idea because they love to come along and nibble on your fruits. So first question, do you need to feed your plants? Well, the short answer is yes. You have to feed them something, even if it's just the compost that you first plant them into. There's three kind of macronutrients that we're going to talk about today: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK. Now, every plant needs some combination of that to get anywhere in life. If you plant them in a completely barren mixture of, say, like clay balls or hydroton, they're not going to get very far. They'll just have the energy that's in the seed. When we talk about feeding, though, what we really mean is supplemental feeding. So once you've planted them into their pot or into the ground, then when do you start giving them a little bit of extra feed? And the question is, do you really need to do the supplemental feeding once they're in their final position? And the answer is no, not necessarily. You don't actually need to feed your plants. If you've got them in a good quality compost, or you've put them in a raised bed, or the ground that you know is fertile, you will get productive plants. They will do their thing, they will reach the end of their life cycle and hopefully set some fruit for you. But there is almost no doubt that supplemental feeding will boost your yields and give you extra crops. So for most people, the answer is you don't need to feed, but it would be foolish not to. It just makes sense, I think. The next two questions, they're quite linked. So what to feed and when to feed. Let's talk about what to feed first, because this depends on your plant. So a lot of plants have very different needs. Today's video is going to be focused mainly on flowering varieties, things like tomatoes, chili peppers, melons, cucumbers, anything that will flower, and then that turns into quite a substantial fruit. Something like a cabbage, for example, is going to need a very different fertilizer feed to something like a tomato. Fruiting varieties, broadly speaking, will benefit from a really good feed with potassium. And when to feed depends once again on your plant. So if you're growing in pots, you want to feed these once those roots have got as big as they possibly can be, once they've filled out their pots, and you'll be able to tell that by the kind of size of their plant with practice and whether or not they're starting to set fruit. So for example, these are starting to just fill up with the first trusses of tomatoes. Generally, if you've potted them onto good compost, they're going to have at least 4 weeks of feed. So you can put them into your final pots and then wait a little while before you start feeding. I'm going to start my chili peppers today with this, which is a Nutrigrow fertilizer. It's kind of a complicated one. There's an A and a B. They kind of cancel each other out if you leave them mixed together for too long. So you mix them together in a watering can. I'll be doing that towards the end of the video, so do stick around if you want to see me watering my peppers. And I do use this as well on all my other flowering varieties. It just makes life easier. There's all sorts of things on the market. Tomarite is a really good kind of all-purpose tomato feed, and you can pick it up pretty much anywhere. There's things like this as well, solid fertilizer, blood, fish and bone, powdered fertilizer, but I find this is much better to put in your potting mix rather than try and get into the soil. If you've got things in beds or things that are already planted in the soil, the roots are deep, and this kind of solid fertilizer is going to take a while to get down to your soil. So I do recommend liquid fertilizer. One thing to be aware of is the risk of overfeeding and using feed as a solution to kind of correct a problem that you might see with a plant. I would really urge caution about this. This is being filmed in June, so we're quite far into the growing season, but if you're watching this outside of then, this is particularly relevant towards the start of the season, the start of the growing season. If you're seeing problems with your plants, I would urge don't immediately jump to feed. There's a lot of other things that might be causing some slow growth or some discoloration. Look at things like the growing conditions, the temperature, how much light is it getting, humidity, all this kind of stuff first, because you do run some risks of doing damage to your plants from overfeeding. If you are kind of in that earlier stage, seaweed fertilizer can be phenomenal for giving plants that kind of instant boost. And seaweed fertilizer is quite balanced, but it is really good source of nitrogen for leafy crops like these brassicas. And I have been giving these a little bit of a seaweed feed every now and then, and they're looking really healthy. Really though, you wouldn't want to use a nitrogen-based fertilizer for your fruiting plants. At the start of the season, it might give them a bit of a boost, but if I was just feeding these throughout the rest of the season with nitrogen, what we would end up with is these magnificent looking green plants. They'd be verdant, they'd have massive bushy growth, but they'd have almost no flowers and very few tomatoes, probably. You can just pick up as well, you know, if this is all a bit much, if you're just in the fertilizer aisle looking for things, or you're online, you can just pick up an all-purpose liquid feed. This is one I've found, Nutrigrow all-purpose concentrate. What you want to do, just look at the back, look at the NPK. This one is 4, 1.5, 4. So that's pretty balanced. You could give something like this to the majority of plants and you get healthier plants with better crops. It really doesn't need to be too complicated. I will say as well though, this Nutrigrow fertilizer, there is a link in the description, and I really do recommend this if you've got fruiting varieties. The next step really is how to feed, and there are some nuances that I want to talk about, and there are different methods here. One thing I will say, this is quite an early feed for my peppers. They've been in their final pots for just coming up to 4 weeks, but I know that they are filling out those pots. So what I'm going to be doing is using a very diluted feed. So when you're first starting to feed your plants, it is a good idea to kind of work up to the full strength, because once again, you just want those roots to be growing as much as possible, growing and searching for water, searching for nutrients, because those roots become a sponge. So later on, 6, 7 weeks from now, I know that all the feed that I give these is going to be immediately absorbed and used to like kind of maximum efficiency, you know, so you get the biggest plants and the best yields. What is really cool about this is when you first buy it, you get these 2 big white containers and they're just full of a powder. What you want to do, add 2.5 litres of warm water to this, give it a good shake with the lid on. And then once you've used all of this, you can just buy a refill pack, which is a bit cheaper, and you just pop the powder back in here and fill it up again, and that's really cool. The instructions on here give you a nice simple ratio per litre of water, and what you want to note is for mature plants it's 6 ml per litre of water, but that is 6 ml of A and 6 ml of B, so 12 millilitres total per litre. Got 2.5 litres of liquid here, so that works out, if you've got a watering can like me, that is 10 litres. This will fill about 41 watering cans, which is quite a lot because I don't feed every time. There isn't really a recommendation on here, but I always err on the side of underfeeding rather than overfeeding. So quite often I will feed, then skip a feed, then feed, and then skip a feed. Now, that might not be the best thing to do. Maybe I could feed a little bit more, but I'm always worried about nutrient kind of building up in the soil, and a lot of fertilizers are salt based, so they're very salty, and that salt can accumulate in the soil and kind of damage your plants. So fortunately, the caps of these are pretty much bang on 60 millilitres. So if you've got a 10 litre can, you can do a cap of this and a cap of this, and that is perfect for your can. If you've got loads of watering to do, what you can do is get a measuring jug out and scale it up, put 4 or 5 times as much of A and B in, give it a good mix, and then just you can kind of eyeball it, or you can measure it properly, but generally speaking, it's pretty easy to use. But this A and B can't be mixed ahead of time. You've got to mix it, then apply it on the same day. I always just have a little, this is not very glamorous, you know, like pretty, maybe the most manky looking measuring jug ever. This has had all sorts of like neem oil and things like that. Best practice, probably use a clean one. It's had seabird guano in there as well, another quite cool organic fertilizer. But then once you've got your mix, what's the best way to actually get this into your plants? Well, if it's pots, I think bottom watering. This is unfortunately fiddly, and if like me you've crammed way too many plants into your greenhouse, makes things a bit more difficult, but I have invested in saucers for all of these pots, and I think that bottom watering is just a great way to make sure you're continuing to encourage root growth, good root growth, searching for that water. Now, one mistake that you can see I've made is that my saucers are probably a little bit small. I should have invested in bigger saucers, but we live and we learn. If you don't have saucers and you're doing top watering, which isn't the best, the way that I usually do it is just counting out. So you kind of have to, it's easiest if you've got consistent pot size, so every one of your plants is in the same pot size. And then you just do 1, 2, 3 in that plant, and then you go on to the next one. 1, 2, 3, on to the next one, etc. And that just makes sure that everything is getting a pretty even feed. If you're feeding every single time you water, you don't really need to worry about that, because you just give the plant as much water as it needs until it starts running through the bottom or collecting in the tray underneath. But there is an easier way as well, and that is using the quad grows. This is very time intensive. It's not particularly efficient. So if you're in an allotment situation, a really good solution is some kind of auto watering solution. I've got next to me some auto pots, which I haven't plumbed in yet, but we're going to be trialing. But I do have up and running these quad grows with my tomatoes in. And for this, it's just so simple. Wow. These drink water at a rate of knots. I probably have to fill this every 2 days or so. And this is as simple as just filling up the reservoir. And I can't remember exactly how big this reservoir is, but you can, if you want, just mix up enough fertilizer for the reservoir, dump that right in, and then dilute the whole lot with water. But you do need to be careful, because if you're doing that and there's a bit of residue left in, and then you add enough fertilizer for the whole reservoir, that can build up. So if you're doing it like that, you need to make sure it's drained completely, which you don't really want to do with the quad grows. Generally, I just think safest bet, do it per 10 litre or 15 litre can, however big you've got. When it comes to fertilizing plants that are in the ground, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. And I must say, a caveat, I don't have much experience with this, but the advice that I have had is that generally speaking, you want to first give the soil a light water, just plain water, no feed or anything, just to kind of prep it a little bit. You can dig in water bottles. This will ensure that any fertilized liquid gets right to the roots of the plant. That's quite good. But what you want to avoid is just all of the fertilizer sitting on the top and not percolating right down. So I'm informed that first you want to wet the soil at the top, and then you want to get your feed in, or kind of on it, and then you probably want to water it through again with a bit of diluted water, just plain water, to kind of get everything down into the roots. If you've got any tips or advice on how to make sure that feed is getting all the way down into your plants, please do let me know. It's one of the reasons that I really love growing in the quad grows. I think one of the reasons I'm going to love the auto pot system and just growing in pots. If you do want to see a bit more about the quad grow, I'll leave this video here and you can purchase them down below. Thank you ever so much, especially to my chili pepper tier patrons, Tony, Bill, Pam, Louise, Michael, Mel, Denise, Socks in the Garden, and Craig. Hopefully I'll see you again in the next one.